Thank you for inviting me. Ladies and gentlemen, according to an inquiry from 2004, the English word serendipity belongs to the 10 English terms that are considered not to be translatable. In the year 2014, it was placed on the 3rd rank in this list. Now, associating this term with the notion of Gute Nachbarschaft, that is, good neighborhood, might seem as if I wished to anglicize the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg before its actual migration, since Gute Nachbarschaft, as you all know, used to be its guiding principle for the arrangement of books in the early years. But I feel encouraged by pure serendipity, so to speak. I found both a study on the paradigm of serendipity and an article on the Warburg tradition in a volume of writings by Carlo Ginzburg, and both articles appeared separately, the first in 1979, the other in 1966, and are not really related. But by chance, in the German translation and edition of some of Ginzburg's writings, they open and conclude a volume that deals with the imponderabilia of scientific and criminalistic work. About the practice of good neighborhood, we know by Fritz Saxel. In his famous account of the history of Warburg's library, he reminds us that it was Warburg's resolve to give the scholar a library uniting the various branches of the history of human civilization, where he could wander from shelf to shelf. Now, Saxel, who visited the library for the first time in 1911, also records that, quote, any young student like myself must have felt rather bewildered when entering it. Saxel came across an excellent collection of books and bibliographies, partly on subjects hitherto unknown to him. Furthermore, quote, the arrangement of the books was equally baffling, and he may, the student, may have found it most peculiar, perhaps that Warburg never tired of shifting and reshifting them. Every progress in his system of thought, every new idea about the interrelation of facts made him regroup the corresponding books. The library changed with every change in his research method and with every variation in his interests. Small as the collection was, it was intensely alive, and Warburg never ceased shaping it so that it might best express his ideas about the history of man. Since in those days in many libraries the old systematic arrangements were abolished and new standardizations, alphabetical or arithmetical arrangements were introduced, the file catalog replaced in most cases that, quote, other and much more scholarly familiarity which, as Saxel put it, is gained by browsing. Warburg, Saxel continues, recognized this danger. He spoke of the law of the good neighbor. The book of which one knew was in most cases not the book which one needed. The unknown neighbor on the shelf contained the vital information, although from its title one might not have guessed it. This dynamic system of alternating neighborhoods irritated not only the young student that Saxel was. He recalls that when the philosopher Ernst Cassirer first came to see the library, quote, he decided either to flee from it, which he did for some time, or to remain there a prisoner for years, which for a certain period he enjoyed doing in later years. Only when in 1920 Warburg fell ill and had to leave Hamburg without knowing if he would ever return, he left Saxel in charge of the library and with the task to transform this intensely personal creation into a public institution. And even though Warburg's system had an inner coherence, there were too many tentative and personal excrescences incompatible with the needs of a library open to an increasing number of scholars. The 4 floors of the library, which corresponded to the basic tenets of Warburgian research, that is image, orientation, word, and action, were maintained. But Saxel and Gertrude Bing developed a system of call numbers in order to facilitate orientation and to avoid displacement. Each call number consisted of 3 colored stripes indicating respectively the field, the country, or epoch, and an appropriate subdivision. Finally, a number would identify the specific subject. So dark green for philosophy, for example, or wine red for art history, yellow for the natural sciences. To cite a famous example, the life of Botticelli, in the card catalogue, an alphanumeric code would direct the reader to a group of books marked red, pink, green, 25. The call numbers thus applied not to specific books, but to thematic subsets in the stacks. Each one could denote a few books or a few dozen. I will not speculate about this very particular Farbenlehre applied in the library of Warburg. But the system has aptly been called a kind of Ariadne's thread that would guide the reader deeper into the labyrinth where new perspectives were opened at each turn. But as you can tell from this slide, the problem, of course, was that the colors of the call numbers, exposed to the sunlight, and I'm afraid to the smoke of cigarettes, faded. You can still see some of the bleached relicts in the Warburg Institute, and a more systematic catalogue became overdue. But the original arrangement, as idiosyncratic as it might have been, allowed to, quote, feel one's way through the stacks, always in a position to survey neighboring topics and hence learn as one went along, as Carl Georg Heise testified about his peripatetic experience in Warburg's library. Derek Dreher recently has characterized this compromise, introduced with the call numbers, as a, quote, careful planning and serendipitous find in equal measure. But he formulates a contradiction in terms when he calls for a directed serendipity, insisting on a clear order in libraries. Dreher himself is a librarian, directs the Rosenbachs in Philadelphia. Directed serendipity, that is what Amazon does with you when you order books there, if you do. But it actually seems as if the law of the good neighborhood somehow preludes the algorithmic linking of the digital age. And Dreher, however, came close to the issue when stating that the serendipitous find depended on knowledge of the range of possibilities. Serendipity is a neologism coined in 1754 by Horace Walpole after he had read, in his words, you can read them on the screen, a silly fairy tale published for the first time in 1557 in Venice, based on a story by presumably the Indian-Persian poet Amir Khusro. And Warburg, who I don't think knew about this, would have loved the trajectory of this novel, in which also Zadig of Voltaire plays a key role. The story tells the story of the three princes of Serendip, which is the ancient name of Ceylon or Sri Lanka. And in a letter to his friend Horace Mann, Walpole wrote, quote, as their highnesses traveled, they were always making discoveries by accident and sagacity of things which they were not in quest of. Serendipity occurs only once in all Walpole's writings, but his neologism has an aptness which has greatly facilitated its eventual diffusion. Particularly, as Robert Merton has observed, those engaged vocationally or avocationally in looking for finds, whether they are antiquarians, book collectors, or scientists, seem to have a special proclivity for accidental sagacity, and as a consequence, they have much enjoyed making use of Walpole's single expressive word to designate their experience. Unfortunately, notes Merton, these amateur scholars, whose vocational interests kept them on the fringes of established academic disciplines, did not come across the word serendipity or use it in the course of professional scholarship, and humanistic scholars did not pick up the term. In fact, the significance and connotations of serendipity, historiographical and otherwise, did not enter the professional consciousness or methodological considerations of practicing historians or historiographical commentators. In fact, the term has been used for over 2 centuries now with various shades of meaning, and mostly with that of accidental discovery. But Hugo Fabietti, in his article on errancy in anthropological research, rightly remembers that this is not the signification Walpole wanted to give to the word he had coined. Walpole actually writes that the three princes continually discovered by accident and sagacity things they had not been looking for. By accident and sagacity, hence, by chance and on the strength of an intuitive reasoning, which Fabietti ascribes to what Ginsburg calls the evidential paradigm founded on abduction. And Fabietti rightly insists, I think, on the conjunction "and," because by mistake one might assume the term serendipity stands exclusively for a chance discovery, which means to ignore its evidential abductive component. And in fact, this misleading reading of the term is sanctioned by the definition of the word given in the concise Oxford Dictionary, where we read serendipity, the faculty of making happy and unexpected discoveries by accident, unquote. Leave out the word happy, and one might simply call it contingency. After Fabietti, the issue is instead linked to the notion of abduction, which, according to Charles Sanders Peirce, indicates the logical process considered by him to be the first step of scientific reasoning, by which, by inference, we obtain information about certain things that have high probability of being true. Abduction, thus, would be the logical process underlying what Ginsburg, in a recognition of the processes of inquiry typical for the human sciences, defined as evidential process, indiciario in the original, a paradigm whose impact would lie precisely in its being not very rigorous, at least insofar as it cannot be quantified, a price which the human sciences seem obliged to pay if they are to achieve results of any importance and, most of all, of any perspicuity. Horace Walpole coined serendipity to describe a kind of experience he had as a collector. According to Robert Merton, there are, among the great variety of collectors, only two kinds to have used the term serendipity, namely bibliophiles and quasi-antiquarians, such as, for example, Edward Solly. All collectors are familiar with different aspects of this experience, the recurrent discrepancy between efforts and results. In a collector's life, the conditions of success are to an unusual extent unknowable, and the notion of serendipity, continues Merton, served to make some sense out of this uncertainty, unquote. And in fact, the earliest bibliophilic user of the word serendipity, the Scottish poet and literary critic Andrew Lang, in 1881 wrote in his book, The Library, quote, "There is a faculty which Horace Walpole named serendipity, the luck of falling on just the literary document which one wants at the moment," unquote. Yet accident, luck, and serendipity play an unrecognized part in shaping the works that historians produce, complained James McClellan in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society in 2005. Quote, "All kinds of seemingly extraneous factors impinge on the research process, but remain invisible in the books and articles written by historians. Accidental factors are necessarily lost from view." McClellan's goal is to rescue them for historiography and to recognize the, quote, "messy realities of historians," unquote, as a fundamental and constitutive part of epistemology, if there is any, in the humanities. Karl Popper, in contrast, rejected any consideration that the context of discovery, he rejected any consideration of the context of discovery, since he claimed, quote, "My view of the matter, for what it is worth, is that there is no such thing as a logical method of having new ideas, or a logical reconstruction of this process," unquote, which recalls Plutarch's dictum according to which man's ways are chance and not sagacity. This was not the conviction of Aby Warburg. His Fragmente zur Ausdruckskunde auf anthropologischer Grundlage proves it impressively. The fragments of the tenet of expression on an anthropological basis, that is the intended title given by Gertrud Bing and Fritz Sachsel to the finally not realized fourth volume of the Werkausgabe. These fragments contain early theoretical notes and book projects of Warburg. They represent his attempts to found his image concept on a coherent, abstract, and logical basis. They can be considered to be a key to understand this early phase of Warburg's thinking and his way of researching between 1888 and 1905, that is, between the writing and final editing of his dissertation on Botticelli and the coining of such fundamental concepts as the pathos formel in his conference on Dürer in 1905. With the critical edition curated by Ulrich Pfisterer and Hans Christian Hoeneß, it came out a couple of months ago only, we now possess an invaluable instrument to access these forming years. Let me just focus on a few aspects that relate to Warburg's procedures and that show that his library system was the exact mirroring of his searching and thinking. In August 1896, Warburg decided to transform his card box that he had established and filled with schedules and notes since 1888, to transform it into a more durable form. He proceeded in transcribing his notes in unaltered and chronological order into a booklet. This transcription was without any doubt intended to form a book. After an interruption of several months, Warburg in 1901 hired a secretary to fulfill the task. By 1905, the transcript was more or less complete. What is astonishing is the fact that Warburg revised only very little parts of the notes on the cards. He seems to have wanted to record ritually the original text. That is particularly evident if we consider that he transcribed also all those parts that he had originally crossed. He transcribed them and crossed them again. These fragments thus appear like a translucent palimpsest. Now, Warburg's card box is in a certain way the equivalent to his library, and browsing through the files corresponded to the browsing through the bookshelves. Cards can always be relocated and newly combined. Maybe the law of good neighborhood does not apply anywhere better than precisely here. Sachsel reports, quote, "Often one saw Warburg standing tired and distressed, bent over his boxes with a packet of index cards, trying to find for each one the best place within the system. It looked like a waste of energy, and one felt sorry," unquote. It seems that Sachsel not quite got, or at least he did not share, Warburg's favorite pastime. But by transcribing the card box and by arranging it in a chronological order, Warburg abrogated its proper dynamics and flexibility. All serendipity lost, one could say. We can only speculate about the motivation that prompted Warburg to transcribe and thus to freeze his card box. Pfisterer and Hoeneß do not exclude that it served Warburg as a sort of justification in front of his family, as a sort of statement of accounts. By documenting his labors, he could have tried to resolve all their doubts concerning his activities. In fact, a safe copy of the transcription was reposited in the safe of the bank of his father. But maybe the true reason was to document, to reconstruct his way of thinking in front of himself. By objectifying his notes, Warburg practiced autohermeneutics, as if he wanted to prove the rightness of his procedures. It is noticeable that among the scare additions Warburg made, the majority are autobiographical comments. It seems as if he auto-inscribed himself in his text, thus parallelizing life and work, and in brief remarks and in some diagrams, he registers his proper travels, discoveries, and events, mapping his own biographical and intellectual itinerary and crossfading it with central spots of the European cultural history, as he did in later geographical diagrams. Here the one where he associates, if you want, Hamburg, Florence, Strasbourg, and Arizona. So physical and mental voyages. Or the other one, connecting Brügge, Toledo, Baghdad, Wittenberg, Hamburg, and Lüneburg. And Lüneburg really only makes sense if you consider that it's close to Hamburg and had some importance on a private level for Warburg. In the fragments, he proceeds in a similar way. So, for example, he notes, from Darwin via Filippino to Botticelli, through Carlyle and Fischer, to the festival tradition, to the Indians, and through Tornabuoni with Ghirlandaio, again to the nymph. The fragments are preceded, this is a serendipitous travel, one could say. The fragments are preceded by a device. It is a quotation from Warburg's teacher, Carl Justi, from his monograph on Winckelmann. And it speaks about the latter's personal biography and scientific curriculum. Quote, I translate, everywhere we recognize a man, Winckelmann, who despite all aimlessness of his erudite odyssey, ignoring his destination in the Republic of Scholars, while working himself through entire provinces of literature, notwithstanding has in all concerns of life and science a secure feeling for all elective affinities, or, to use a metaphysical image, by seeming to volatilize and to lose himself in the macrocosm of an universal library, his microcosm simply reflects whereto he, as vis representativa universi, is predeterminated, unquote. As Fischer and Hoeneß remind us, Justi was a master of the combination of seemingly contingent events and biographical moments, serendipity as it were. And in fact, also the fragments show often Warburg's own propensity to entangle somehow coincidental facts and events, filling them with sense. The list is long. As contingent as many of these occurrences may seem, Warburg believed in a somehow fateful necessity, in something like predetermination. Or, to circumscribe it with the words of the French chemist Louis Pasteur, dans les champs de l'observation, le hasard ne favorise que les esprits préparés. Chance favors only the prepared mind. About his first encounter with the writing of Charles Darwin in Florence in 1888, we will hear from the importance of the latter for Warburg in Siegfried Weigel's talk that will follow. Warburg in the fragments reports belatedly in 1896, zufällig auf der Bibliotheca Nationale Darwins Ausdruck der Gemütsbewegung in die Hand bekommen und aufmerksam gelesen. In the Bibliotheca Nationale, I got randomly Darwin's The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals into the hands and read it attentively. What is now particularly noteworthy here is that the word random, zufällig, is put into quotation marks. This means nothing else but that there is, after all, in Warburg's view, no such thing as Zufall, because quotation marks mean as if. There is no Zufall, no accident, but predestination. Sage algorithms, if you want, abduction, accident, and sagacity, hence serendipity, or to put it in an equally somehow untranslatable term, probably it's all about Wahlverwandtschaften. Thank you very much.